The sonar operator aboard U-544 heard it first, a faint, rhythmic thrumming that didn't match any known convoy escort pattern. It was March 24th, 1944, approximately 400 miles west of the Azores, in waters that had belonged to the U-boats since the war began. Captain-Lieutenant Hans-Jürgen Hellriegel ordered his boat to periscope depth. What he saw through the lens made no sense. A small aircraft carrier, impossibly small, steaming alone without the massive task force such vessels required. American, judging by the markings, but carriers didn't operate in mid-Atlantic, not alone, not this far from any fleet concentration. His first thought was that it was a trap. His second thought was that it was an opportunity. The standing orders were clear. Sink enemy tonnage wherever found. A carrier, even a small one, would be a prize worth the risk. What Hellriegel didn't know, what no U-boat commander yet fully understood, was that this ship represented something far more dangerous than its size suggested. This was USS Block Island, a Bogue-class escort carrier, and she wasn't alone. She was hunting him. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The escort carrier had been designed not to project naval air power across oceans, but to close the one gap the Allies couldn't otherwise fill, the mid-Atlantic air coverage zone, where land-based aircraft from Britain, Iceland, Greenland, and Newfoundland couldn't reach. For 3 years, this gap had been the killing ground where German submarines operated with near impunity. In 1942 and early 1943, U-boats sent Allied shipping to the bottom at rates that threatened to strangle Britain's supply lines entirely. Convoys that entered the gap without air cover suffered losses approaching 20%. The submarines could surface, run on, diesel engines at higher speeds, spot targets from their conning towers, and attack at leisure. But in 1943, something changed. Small carriers began appearing in the Atlantic, converted from merchant hulls, carrying fewer than 30 aircraft each. They were slow, vulnerable, and dismissed by many German submarine commanders as nuisances. They were called Kaiser coffins by some American sailors, cheaply built vessels that flexed and groaned in heavy seas. Their flight decks were so short that aircraft landing procedures were terrifying even in calm conditions. They lacked the armour, speed, and defensive armament of fleet carriers. They looked like improvised solutions, like desperate measures by a navy that couldn't build real carriers fast enough. The Germans called them baby flattops when they bothered to mention them at all in operational briefings. Compared to the massive fleet carriers like Enterprise or Yorktown, the escort carriers seemed almost comical. Block Island displaced 11,000 tons fully loaded. Enterprise displaced nearly 20,000 tons. Block Island could make 17 knots at maximum speed. Enterprise could make 33 knots. Block Island carried 24 aircraft. Enterprise carried 90. But Block Island and her sisters weren't designed to fight Japanese carriers at Midway. They were designed to hunt submarines in the Atlantic. And in that specific role, with their embarked squadrons of Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers and F-4F Wildcat fighters, they were about to prove devastatingly effective. The German submarine force in 1944 was fighting a very different war than the one it had begun in 1939. In the early years, U-boat crews spoke of the happy time, die glückliche Zeit, when Allied convoys were poorly defended and submarines operated with near-complete freedom. From June through October 1940, German submarines sank over 270. Allied ships totaling more than 1.4 million tons. Individual boats returned to French ports flying victory pennants, their conning towers painted with rows of tiny ship silhouettes representing confirmed kills. The crews were volunteers, considered elite within the Kriegsmarine. Training was rigorous. lasting months, covering everything from torpedo calculations to damage control to the psychological preparation needed for weeks submerged in a steel tube beneath the Atlantic. The boats themselves were technological marvels for their time. The Type 7C, which would become the workhorse of the U-boat fleet, displaced 769 tons on the surface and displaced 865 tons submerged. It could travel 8,500 nautical miles at 10 knots on the surface, using diesel engines. Submerged, running on electric motors, it could travel 80 nautical miles at 4 knots before battery depletion forced it to surface. The weapons were effective. 4 bow tubes and 1 stern tube could launch G7 torpedoes, each carrying a 620-pound warhead. Later models carried the G7E electric torpedo, which left no bubble wake to betray its approach. A well-trained crew could reload tubes in under 10 minutes. Fire control calculations, performed by hand using mechanical computers, could put torpedoes on target at ranges exceeding 4,000 meters. The tactical doctrine was sophisticated. U-boats operated in wolf packs, Rudeltaktik, coordinated groups that could overwhelm convoy escorts through sheer numbers. A submarine spotting a convoy would shadow it while radiating position reports to U-boat headquarters in France. Additional boats would converge on the coordinates. When sufficient force had assembled, usually 8 to 15 submarines, they would attack simultaneously from multiple directions, saturating the escort's ability to respond. The psychological advantage was enormous. Allied merchant sailors lived in terror of the torpedo strike that could come without warning, day or night. The U-boat crew, by contrast, felt they controlled the engagement. They chose when to attack, when to withdraw, when to surface, and when to dive. The ocean was vast, and a submarine on the surface at night was nearly invisible to visual lookouts. Radar existed, but early British and American radar sets were primitive, unreliable, and easily evaded by experienced commanders who understood their limitations. By 1943, over 400 U-boats were operational or under construction. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, who had taken command of the entire German Navy in January 1943, was himself a submarine veteran from World War I. He believed absolutely in the U-boat as Germany's path to victory. His strategic calculation was straightforward. If German submarines could sink ships faster than Allied shipyards could replace them, Britain would be starved into submission, and America's ability to project power across the Atlantic would be crippled. The mathematics seemed to support him. In 1942, U-boats sank over 6 million tons of Allied shipping. In the first 5 months of 1943, they sank another over 1.8 million tons. These were staggering losses. Liberty ships, the mass-produced American cargo vessels that formed the backbone of convoy traffic, took roughly 42 days to build. Sinking them took minutes. U-boat crews in early 1943 still believed they were winning. They had losses, certainly. Depth charges from destroyers and corvettes were dangerous. Aircraft were a nuisance, forcing boats to submerge and lose contact with convoys. But the losses seemed acceptable relative to the tonnage being sent to the bottom. Crews that survived their first patrol gained confidence. Those who survived 3 patrols were considered veterans. Those who survived 5 were heroes, decorated and promoted. The boats operating in the mid-Atlantic Gap felt particularly secure. Without air cover, convoys relied entirely on surface escorts. A U-boat could surface at night, recharge batteries, run at higher speeds to reach attack positions, and dive only when escorts came close. The tactic worked month after month, convoy after convoy. The Allies understood the submarine threat from the war's first day. When U-30 sank the liner Athenia on September 3, 1939, killing 118 people, including 28 Americans, it signaled that Germany would wage unrestricted submarine warfare as it had in World War I. The question was how to counter it. Traditional destroyer escorts were effective but scarce. Building a destroyer took a year. They were expensive, requiring sophisticated engineering and skilled labor. They couldn't be everywhere at once. Aircraft were more promising. A single patrol plane could search thousands of square miles in a day. When a surfaced U-boat spotted an aircraft, its only option was to dive immediately, losing contact with the convoy and wasting hours submerged while batteries drained. But aircraft had range limitations. British Coastal Command flew Sunderland flying boats and Liberator bombers from bases in Britain, Iceland, and Northern Ireland. The Americans flew patrol bombers from Newfoundland and later from the Azores. But there remained a gap, roughly 600 miles wide at its narrowest point, where no land-based aircraft could reach. This was the Black Pit, and it was where U-boats concentrated their forces. The solution proposed was simple in concept but difficult in execution. Put aircraft on ships and send those ships with the convoys. Fleet carriers were far too valuable for convoy escort duty. They were needed in the Pacific against Japan and in the Mediterranean supporting amphibious operations. Besides, their size made them vulnerable in the confined waters of the Atlantic where U-boats lurked. What was needed was something smaller, cheaper, and producible in quantity. The British developed the concept first, with auxiliary carriers converted from merchant hulls. HMS Audacity, converted from a captured German merchant ship, entered service in June 1941, carrying just 6 aircraft. She proved the concept by protecting convoy OG-74 in December 1941, her fighters driving off German reconnaissance aircraft and forcing U-boats to submerge. Audacity was torpedoed and sunk by U-751 on December 21, 1941, but she had demonstrated that small carriers could protect convoys. The Americans embraced the concept with characteristic industrial ambition. In January 1942, the Maritime Commission and the Navy began converting merchant hulls into escort carriers. The first, USS Long Island, commissioned in June 1941, was an experimental prototype. The Bogue class, which would become the standard Atlantic escort carrier, began commissioning in September 1942. These ships were built fast and built cheap. Hulls originally designed for merchant service were modified with flight decks, hangar spaces, and minimal defensive armament. Construction time averaged 6 months from laying the keel to commissioning. Cost per ship was approximately $6 million, roughly 1/3 the cost of a destroyer and 1/20th the cost of a fleet carrier. By the end of 1943, over 30 escort carriers were in service or under construction for Atlantic operations. The aircraft they carried were equally pragmatic. The Grumman TBF Avenger was originally designed as a fleet torpedo bomber, but in the Atlantic it carried depth charges instead. 4 Mark 47 depth charges, each weighing 350 pounds, and carrying 200 pounds of Torpex explosive, were loaded on external racks. The Avenger had the range to patrol 200 miles from the carrier, the endurance to remain on station for hours, and the ability to attack immediately when a submarine was spotted. The F-4F Wildcat fighters embarked on escort carriers served a different role. They protected the carrier from German long-range reconnaissance aircraft, particularly the Focke-Wulf W-200 Condor maritime patrol bombers that directed U-boats to convoys. They also strafed U-boats, forcing them to dive or suppressing their anti-aircraft fire while Avengers made depth charge runs. The tactics developed quickly through trial and error. Escort carriers didn't steam with the convoy itself. That would make them vulnerable and restrict their maneuverability. Instead, they operated with hunter-killer groups, independent task units built around a single escort carrier with 4 to 6 destroyer escorts. These groups would sweep ahead of convoys, investigate contacts, and actively hunt submarines rather than simply reacting to attacks. The first, successful hunter-killer operation centered on USS Bogue and her escorts in March 1943. Commander Howard Avery commanded Composite Squadron 9, flying from Bogue's deck with 12 Avengers and 9 Wildcats. On March 11, 1943, one of his Avengers spotted U-656 on the surface approximately 200 miles southeast of Cape Farewell, Greenland. The submarine crash-dived, but the Avenger dropped 4 depth charges in a perfect straddle pattern. U-656 surfaced moments later, mortally damaged, and was finished off by the destroyer escort USS Green. It was the first U-boat kill by aircraft from an American escort carrier. The kill validated the concept, but it also revealed how difficult the hunting would be. The Atlantic Ocean covers over 31 million square miles. A U-boat on the surface presented a target roughly 250 feet long and 23 feet wide at its beam. From an aircraft flying at 1,500 feet, a surfaced submarine was visible for perhaps 10 to 12 miles in good conditions. In poor visibility, fog, rain, or at night, aircraft were nearly useless. U-boats learned quickly to dive at the first sight or sound of aircraft, and a Type 7C could submerge completely in under 30 seconds when properly executed. But the Avenger crews developed tactics to counter these limitations. They learned to approach from out of the sun when possible, hiding their silhouette until the last moment. They learned to watch for the white wake that submarines threw, even when running just below the surface. They learned to drop depth charges not where the submarine was when spotted, but where it would be after diving, calculating the probable position based on the boat's heading and the time elapsed since submergence. The Mark 47 depth charge was set to detonate at either 25 feet or 50 feet depth, depending on the tactical situation. If the U-boat had just dived, 25 feet was optimal, catching it before it could reach safer depths. If the submarine had been submerged longer, 50 feet accounted for its descent. The Torpex explosive was 50% more powerful than TNT pound for pound. A near miss within 20 feet could crack a pressure hull. A direct hit would tear a submarine apart. Composite Squadron 9 under Commander Avery refined their procedures through the spring and summer of 1943. They practiced coordinated attacks where multiple aircraft would converge on a target from different directions, preventing the submarine from maneuvering away from all threats. They developed communication protocols using voice radio, allowing the carrier's Combat Information Center to vector aircraft toward contacts reported by destroyer escorts or by other aircraft. By July 1943, USS Card and her Composite Squadron 1 joined Bogue in active operations. Card's commanding officer, Captain Arnold, Buster Isbell, was an aggressive tactician who pushed his aircraft to the limits of their endurance. His philosophy was simple: find submarines before they find convoys, attack them relentlessly, and give them no rest. Under Isbell's command, Card's aircraft would be credited with 8 U-boat kills between July and December 1943. The aircraft themselves were constantly being improved. Early Avengers had crude radar sets that were unreliable and difficult to operate. By late 1943, the ASH radar system installed in Avengers could detect a surfaced submarine at 10 to 12 miles range even in darkness or poor visibility. This technological advancement was devastating to U-boat operations. Submarines that had felt safe surfacing at night to recharge batteries now found themselves illuminated by radar and attacked without warning. The doctrine evolved from simple patrol patterns to aggressive prosecution of contacts. When a submarine was detected, the escort carrier's entire available air group would be launched. Avengers would maintain contact, dropping sonobuoys and flares to mark the submarine's position. Wildcats would strafe the conning tower if the U-boat remained surfaced, suppressing its anti-aircraft fire and killing or wounding crew members who were operating the deck guns. Destroyer escorts would race toward the contact at maximum speed, their sonar systems active, ready to deliver depth-charge attacks if the submarine went deep. The Germans called these operations Verdammte Jagd, the damned hunt. From the U-boat's perspective, the hunter-killer groups represented a new and terrifying threat. Unlike convoy escorts that had to remain with their charges, the hunter-killer groups roamed freely, actively seeking submarines. A U-boat that surfaced to charge batteries might find aircraft overhead within minutes. A boat that radioed a convoy sighting might find itself hunted by destroyers, vectored to its transmission coordinates. The psychological pressure was immense. U-boat commanders in late 1943 began reporting that they felt hunted constantly. The operational reports sent back to Donitz's headquarters in France documented a sharp increase in aircraft encounters. Boats that had once spent 70% of their patrol time on the surface, using their diesel engines for speed and endurance, now spent 70% of their time submerged, crawling along at 4 knots on battery power, blind except for occasional periscope observations. The effect on patrol effectiveness was dramatic. A U-boat traveling submerged took twice as long to reach its operational area. It consumed batteries that then required surface time to recharge, exposing it to aircraft attack. It couldn't see distant convoys and couldn't respond quickly to headquarters instructions. The entire tactical system that had made Wolfpack operations successful began breaking down. By April 1945, Germany's strategic situation was hopeless. Soviet forces were fighting in Berlin. American and British armies had crossed the Rhine and were driving deep into Germany. The U-boat bases in France had fallen months earlier, forcing submarines to operate from Norwegian ports far from the Atlantic convoy routes. But Dönitz continued to send boats to sea, and in early April he assembled one final major operation. The mission was designated Seawolf. 43 U-boats, the largest concentration sent on a single operation since 1943, were to sail to the American coast. Their official mission was to attack coastal shipping and disrupt supply lines, supporting the final assault on Germany. But intelligence suggested a darker purpose. Some boats might carry V-2 rocket components or even be modified to launch V-2 missiles at American cities from offshore. American naval intelligence, reading German radio traffic through ultra-decryption, detected the submarine concentration as it departed Norwegian bases. Admiral Jonas Ingram, commanding the Atlantic Fleet, ordered 2 barrier forces to intercept. Barrier Force 1, under Captain George Dyer aboard the escort carrier USS Mission Bay, established a patrol line southeast of Newfoundland. Barrier Force 2, commanded by Captain John Alves aboard USS Croatan, covered approaches further south. The barrier forces included 6 escort carriers: Mission Bay, Croatan, Kor, Bogue, Vela Gulf, and Natoma Bay. Supporting them were 42 destroyer escorts. The aircraft complement totaled over 120 Avengers and Wildcats. It was the largest anti-submarine operation ever mounted by the United States Navy. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Contact came on April 15, 1945. An Avenger from Mission Bay detected U-880 on the surface, recharging, batteries 600 miles east of Cape Race, Newfoundland. The submarine's lookouts spotted the aircraft and the boat began its crash dive. The Avenger pilot, Lieutenant Junior Grade Richard Stewart, pushed his throttle forward and went into a shallow dive, racing to reach attack position before the submarine submerged completely. Stewart dropped 4 Mark 47 depth charges in a textbook straddle pattern. The charges entered the water just as U-880's conning tower disappeared beneath the surface. Underwater, the pressure hull was descending through 40 feet when the Torpex charges detonated. The shock wave, travelling through water at nearly 5,000 feet per second, struck the submarine's starboard side. Rivets sheared, plates buckled. The pressure hull cracked along a weld line near the forward torpedo room. Water flooded into the boat under tremendous pressure. The crew in the forward compartment had perhaps 5 seconds before the water reached them. They died by drowning or by the sudden pressure change that crushed their lungs. The submarine's descent became uncontrolled. At 300 feet, well below the Type IC's design crush depth of 230 meters, the pressure hull imploded catastrophically. U-880 disappeared from history with all 56 men aboard. Over the next 4 days, aircraft from the barrier forces hunted relentlessly. On April 16th, Avengers from USS Corps found U-235 and U-880 in close proximity, possibly trying to rendezvous. Both submarines were attacked. U-235 was depth-charged and sunk with all hands. U-880 was damaged, but managed to dive deep and escape, only to be found again hours later by aircraft from Croatan and finished off by destroyer escorts with Hedgehog mortars. April 17th brought more kills. U-518 was caught on the surface by aircraft from Bogue. The submarine fought back with its anti-aircraft, guns, a quad 20mm mount, and a 37mm gun on the Wintergarten platform behind the conning tower. The gunners managed to damage one Avenger, hitting its engine and forcing the pilot to ditch near a destroyer escort where the crew was rescued. But 3 other Avengers pressed home their attacks, bracketing the submarine with depth charges. U-518 went down in water too deep for any salvage attempt, taking all 55 crew members with her. Aboard U-227, Captain Lieutenant Friedrich Altmaier monitored the radio traffic with growing horror. The encryption system supposedly kept German communications secure, but somehow the Americans seemed to know exactly where the U-boats were operating. Altmaier's orders were to proceed to a position off New York Harbor, submerge to periscope depth, and wait for targets of opportunity. But reaching that position was proving impossible. Every time U-227 surfaced to charge batteries, aircraft appeared. Sometimes it was just one Avenger, circling at a distance, clearly radioing the submarine's position. Other times it was multiple aircraft, coordinating their attacks, forcing the boat to dive immediately and abandon the battery charge. After 3 days of this harassment, Altmaier calculated that his batteries were at 40% capacity. At current drain rates, he had perhaps 30 hours of submerged operation remaining before the boat would be forced to surface regardless of conditions. His crew was exhausted. The youngest sailor aboard was 18 years old, conscripted into the Kriegsmarine 6 months earlier and given abbreviated training before being assigned to U-227. The oldest was a chief engineer, 42 years old, a veteran who had served on surface ships before volunteering for submarines in 1942. Between them were 55 other men, crammed into a pressure hull 252 feet long with an interior, diameter of approximately 15 feet at its widest. They lived among their weapons and machinery. Torpedoes filled the forward and aft compartment spaces, leaving only narrow passages between them. The control room, located amidships beneath the conning tower, was packed with diving planes controls, rudder controls, ballast tank manifolds, and the attack periscope. The diesel engine room aft of the control room housed two supercharged 9-cylinder engines that generated 4,200 horsepower when running on the surface. The electric motor room, aft of the diesel room, contained the batteries and electric motors that powered underwater movement. Food was stored wherever space existed. Sausages hung from pipes in the forward torpedo room. Bread, wrapped in waxed paper to prevent mold, was stacked in the bilges. Potatoes filled mesh bags suspended from the overhead. Fresh vegetables lasted perhaps a week before spoiling. After that, the crew subsisted on canned goods, dried, beans, and Zwieback biscuits that became so hard they had to be soaked before eating. Water was severely rationed. Each man received 1 litre per day for all purposes: drinking, cooking, and washing. Most men didn't wash at all, conserving their water ration for drinking in the stale, humid air of the submerged boat. The smell became overwhelming after a few days at sea, a mixture of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, food waste, and the chemical toilets that could only be flushed when the submarine was on the surface. Altmaier had made 4 previous war patrols. His first, in late 1942, had been successful. Yuan 227 had sunk 3 freighters from a slow convoy southwest of Ireland, totaling 16,000 tons. He had been decorated with the Iron Cross Second Class and promoted. His second patrol had been less successful, with only 1 confirmed kill. His third patrol had found no targets at all, with the boat spending most of its time submerged, avoiding aircraft. His fourth patrol had been cut short when the boat was damaged by depth charges from a British frigate, forcing a return to port. This fifth patrol, which Altmaier knew in his heart would be his last, felt different from the beginning. The atmosphere at the submarine base in Bergen, Norway, had been grim. Everyone knew the war was lost. Soviet armies were approaching from the east, Americans and British from the west. The Luftwaffe was destroyed. The Wehrmacht was disintegrating. But orders were orders, and German naval officers still obeyed them. On April 22, 1945, Uwon 227's batteries finally gave out. Altmaier had no choice but to surface in daylight, something no experienced U-boat commander would do except in the most desperate circumstances. The boat broke through the surface 630 miles east of Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. The diesel engines coughed to life immediately, their superchargers whining as they began, turning generators to recharge the depleted battery banks. Altmaier posted extra lookouts with orders to watch the sky continuously. He calculated they needed at least 4 hours of surface time to bring the batteries to operational capacity. He didn't get 4 hours. He got 11 minutes. An Avenger from USS Croatan, piloted by Lieutenant Raymond Moore, was on routine patrol when his radar operator called out a contact at 9 miles. Moore altered course toward the bearing and climbed to 3,000 feet for better visibility. Through broken clouds, he spotted the distinctive shape of a Type 9C submarine, fully surfaced, throwing white wake as it ran at maximum speed. Moore radioed the contact back to Croatan and began his attack run. On Uwon 227's bridge, the lookouts spotted the Avenger when it was still 3 miles away. Altmaier didn't hesitate. He ordered the crash dive alarm sounded immediately. Below, men scrambled to diving stations. The chief engineer shut down the diesel engines. The electric motors engaged. Ballast tank vents opened, allowing seawater to flood into the tanks and increase the boat's weight. But the Type 9C was larger and heavier than the Type 7C, and it took longer to submerge. The conning tower was still visible when Moore's Avenger roared overhead at 200 feet altitude. 4 Mark 47 depth charges fell in a precise line, each separated by about 60 feet, bracketing the submarine's position perfectly. The charges were set for 25-foot detonation depth. They exploded just as U-1227 passed through 30 feet, still descending with dive planes angled down and tons of water rushing into ballast tanks. The first explosion was close enough that men inside the hull heard it not as a distant boom, but as a sharp metallic crack that resonated through every frame and plate. The second explosion was closer. The third was catastrophic. The pressure hull ruptured between frames, 23 and 24, near the control room. Water entered under pressure measured in thousands of pounds per square inch. Men in the control room died instantly, crushed by the water hammer effect or drowned before they could draw breath. The submarine's descent became uncontrolled. Emergency blow systems, designed to force compressed air into ballast tanks and drive water out, were useless because the men who would have activated them were already dead. UN-227 sank to the bottom in approximately 4,000 feet of water. Of the 57 men aboard, none survived. The boat joined U-880, UN-235, U-880, and U-518 on the bottom of the Atlantic. 5 submarines destroyed in 1 week by aircraft from American escort carriers. The killing continued. On April 24th, aircraft from USS Bogue found U-858 and sent her to the bottom. On April 29th, U-326 was caught by planes from Mission Bay and destroyed. On April 30th, as Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker in Berlin, aircraft from Corps sank U-546. On May 1st, U-881 was destroyed by planes from Croatan. On May 5th, 3 days before Germany's unconditional surrender, aircraft from Vella Gulf sank U-881 in what would be one of the final U-boat kills of the European War. Operation Teardrop, which the Germans had intended as one final demonstration of U-boat capability, had become instead a demonstration of how completely the Allies had mastered anti-submarine warfare. Of the 43 U-boats that departed Norwegian ports in early April 1945, only 5 reached their operational areas off the American coast. Not one managed to sink an Allied ship. 6 were destroyed by aircraft from escort carriers. 3 more were sunk by destroyer escorts working with the barrier forces. The remainder were either recalled to Germany as the Reich collapsed, or surrendered to Allied forces after Germany's capitulation. The mathematical reality was undeniable. In the first 5 months of 1943, before escort carriers became common in the Atlantic, U-boats had sunk 348 Allied ships. In the first 5 months of 1944, with escort carriers and hunter-killer groups operating routinely, U-boats sank 34 ships. The tonnage destroyed had dropped from over 1.6 million tons to under 200,000 tons. The cost ratio had inverted completely. In 1943's first months, Germany lost 15 U-boats per month on average. In 1944, that number had risen to 25 U-boats per month. By 1945, U-boats were being destroyed faster than German yards could build them. The final accounting of the Battle of the Atlantic reveals numbers that would have seemed impossible to German planners in 1940. The Kriegsmarine commissioned 1,154 U-boats during World War II. Another 156 were scuttled by their own crews or surrendered at war's end. The loss rate was 68% of all boats commissioned, and an even more devastating 75% of boats that actually conducted war patrols. Approximately 39,000 men served in the U-boat force during the war. 28,000 died in action or went down with their boats and were never recovered. 5,000 were taken prisoner. Only 6,000 survived the war and returned home. The casualty rate was 72%, making the U-boat service the most dangerous branch of any military service in any nation during World War II. These losses weren't distributed evenly across the war. In 1940 and 1941, when U-boats dominated the Atlantic, monthly losses averaged 3 to 4 boats. Crews who survived their first patrols had reasonable odds of surviving additional patrols. Veterans accumulated kills, earned decorations, and trained new crews. The aces, commanders like Günther Prien, Otto Kretschmer, and Joachim Schepke, became national heroes, their faces appearing on propaganda posters and newsreels. But by late 1943, the character of the battle had fundamentally changed. Monthly losses jumped to 20, then 25, then 30 U-boats. New crews often didn't survive their first patrol. The average U-boat in 1944 lasted 4 months before being destroyed. Many lasted only weeks. The veteran commanders who survived were pushed beyond exhaustion, sent on patrol after patrol because experienced officers were too valuable to rest. Many of them eventually died at sea, their experience and skill insufficient against overwhelming Allied technological and numerical superiority. The escort carriers played a disproportionate role in this transformation. From 1943 through the war's end, aircraft from American escort carriers sank or damaged over 70 German and Italian submarines in the Atlantic. British escort carriers added approximately 30 more kills. These numbers represented roughly 15% of all U-boats destroyed, but their psychological impact far exceeded the raw statistics. The escort carriers closed the air gap, eliminating the one area where U-boats had operated freely. They enabled hunter-killer tactics that turned the hunters into the hunted. They provided persistent aerial surveillance that forced U-boats to remain submerged, drastically reducing their effectiveness. They embodied American industrial capacity, with 38 escort carriers built for Atlantic service in roughly 2 years, a production rate Germany couldn't hope to match even if it had prioritized carrier construction. Captain Gallery, commanding officer of USS Guadalcanal and one of the most successful hunter-killer group commanders, later wrote that the escort carrier was the weapon that broke the U-boat force. Not through any single dramatic battle, but through relentless pressure that wore down German crews physically and psychologically. Every surfacing risked attack, every radio transmission risked detection. Every mile travelled toward the convoy routes meant running a gauntlet of patrolling aircraft that could appear without warning and attack with devastating effectiveness. German survivors interviewed after the war consistently mentioned the aircraft as their greatest fear. Depth charges from destroyers were terrifying, but they could be evaded by diving deep and running silent. Aircraft were different. They could see the submarine before the submarine knew they were there. They attacked with speed that left no time to react, and there seemed to be endless numbers of them, patrolling every sector of the Atlantic at all hours. The technology gap only widened as the war progressed. By 1944, American Avengers carried ASH radar that could detect surfaced submarines in darkness or poor weather. They carried improved depth charges with magnetic detonators that exploded when passing near a submarine's steel hull. They carried sonobuoys that could be dropped into the water to detect submerged submarines acoustically. They carried rockets for strafing attacks, and they were supported by combat information centers aboard the escort carriers that could process multiple contacts simultaneously and vector aircraft toward targets with precision. The men who served aboard U-2, U-7, U-880, U-518, and the dozens of other submarines destroyed by escort carrier aircraft in the final years of the war were not fundamentally different from the men who achieved such success in 1940 and 1941. They had received the same training, often from the same instructors. They served in boats built to the same specifications in the same yards. They carried the same weapons and followed the same tactical doctrine. What had changed was not the quality of German submarines or submariners. What had changed was that their opponents had adapted, had developed new technologies and tactics specifically designed to counter the U-boat threat, and had applied industrial resources on a scale Germany could not match. The Escort carrier represented this transformation perfectly. It was not a weapon of elegance or sophistication. It was converted merchant hull, slow and vulnerable, carrying modest numbers of aircraft. But it was available in quantity, it could be produced quickly and cheaply, and it was designed for the specific task of hunting submarines in the mid-Atlantic. Against that focused application of industrial power and tactical innovation, German submarine crews found themselves outmatched despite their courage, training, and determination. The psychological cost for German submariners who survived long enough to understand this reality was profound. They had been told they were the elite, that their boats represented technological superiority, that their service would determine Germany's fate. Instead, they found themselves hunted by aircraft from improvised carriers, sunk by weapons they couldn't evade, overwhelmed by numbers they couldn't hope to counter. After the war, historians and analysts studied the Battle of the Atlantic extensively. The consensus emerged that several factors contributed to Germany's defeat in the submarine campaign: the breaking of German naval codes through ultra-intelligence, the development of centimetric radar that U-boats couldn't detect, improvements in sonar and depth charges, the allocation of sufficient escort vessels to protect convoys, and the closing of the air gap through escort carriers and long-range patrol aircraft. But for the men aboard U-Own 227 on April 22, 1945, watching an Avenger begin its attack run, the historical analysis didn't matter. What mattered was the immediate, visceral knowledge that they were about to die in a steel tube at the bottom of the Atlantic, that their training and courage meant nothing against an opponent with better equipment and overwhelming numerical superiority, and that their sacrifice would not change the war's outcome because the war was already lost. The United States built 115 escort carriers during World War II. 38 served primarily in the Atlantic, 77 served in the Pacific. They cost approximately $6 million each to build, roughly 1/20th the cost of a fleet carrier. They were crewed by men who often had minimal naval experience, trained in abbreviated programs designed to create adequate crews quickly rather than excellent crews slowly. They were built in shipyards that had never constructed warships before, using construction techniques adapted from merchant shipbuilding. Yet these improvised weapons, these baby flattops and Kaiser coffins, that German submariners initially dismissed as minor threats, played a decisive role in winning the Battle of the Atlantic. They embodied the American approach to industrial warfare: build adequate weapons in overwhelming quantity, apply them with systematic persistence, and accept that individual excellence matters less than collective capability. For Germany, which had built its military tradition on the concept of superior training and equipment compensating for numerical disadvantage, this was a lesson learned too late and at catastrophic cost. The U-boat force that began the war as an elite service confident in its technological edge and tactical superiority ended the war with 3/4 of its personnel dead, its boats hunted to extinction, and its strategic mission utterly failed. The 43 U-boats sent on Operation Teardrop in April 1945 represented one final attempt to demonstrate that German submarines could still threaten Allied operations. Instead, they demonstrated how completely the tactical situation had reversed. The hunters had become the hunted. The weapons that were supposed to strangle Britain and cripple American logistics had themselves been strangled by a combination of technological innovation, code-breaking, tactical adaptation, and industrial production that Germany could not counter. When Kapitänleutnant Altmaier ordered U-Own 227 to crash dive on April 22, 1945, He knew his boat had perhaps 30 seconds before the aircraft overhead would attack. He knew the batteries were too depleted to sustain extended underwater operation. He knew that even if they survived this attack, another aircraft would find them when they surfaced again. He knew, in that moment of absolute clarity, that he and his 56 crew members were already dead, killed not by any failure of their own, but by strategic decisions made years earlier in Berlin by men who had underestimated their enemies and overestimated their own capabilities. The depth charges that destroyed Yuon 227 90 seconds later simply confirmed what Altmaier already understood. The war was lost, the U-boat force was finished, and the small escort carriers that German intelligence had initially dismissed as insignificant had proven to be among the most effective anti-submarine weapons ever deployed. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.